Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first installment of the Educational Transformation, Education and Equity Speaker Series. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are so thrilled for the first time, but hopefully not the last time, to co-host our panel tonight with the lovely folks from the Racial Equity and Education Law and Policy Clinic here at Georgetown Law. Give them a round of applause for co-sponsoring, co-planning, and hosting us in this beautiful building. It's always wonderful to get off of main campus and into the city a little bit. So a little bit about the clinic. The clinic engages law students in legislative lawyering work on behalf of clients to address issues of racial inequality in public education. And you will see pretty quickly, I think, the significant overlap between what we do at Ed Transformation. So my name is Kristen Sinclair. I'm a professor in the Advocacy and Policy track here at the Ed Transformation program. The Masters of Educational Transformation program is a 12-month interdisciplinary residency-based program that brings a social justice and equity-based lens to teaching, learning, advocacy, and policy. We have two concentrations in our program: learning and teaching, which is our joint master's in teacher certification program focused on culturally and linguistically responsive and asset-based teaching. And then advocacy and policy, which gives students the conceptual tools and knowledge to transform both the policies and structures of education in order to support vibrant anti-racist classroom practices. If this sounds interesting to you and you are not currently a student or alumni, our priority scholarship application deadline for our next cohort is December 15th. Applications, are they open yet? Yep. Applications are open. So I just had to give a little spiel for us. And let's get down to business. So our panel tonight on curriculum as a tool of oppression and resistance, I think is such a great topic for bringing these groups together. It covers, is broadly relevant for teachers, policymakers, advocates, lawyers, and really anyone who's interested in the future of public education, democracy, and educational and racial justice, which hopefully is most people, hopefully. Our moderator tonight, I'm going to do some introductions, is Professor Janel George. Janel George is an associate professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center and the founding director of REAL. Her work and scholarship focus on racial stratification and inequality in U.S. education and legislative and policy interventions to help address educational inequality. She has written about the resegregation of public schools, discriminatory school discipline practices, critical race theory, and resource equity. As a civil rights attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDF, she worked with several campaigns and coalitions to leverage legislative and policy advocacy to advance equal educational opportunity. She has served as legislative counsel in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, during which time her legislative portfolio included child welfare, civil rights, healthcare, and education issues. So I would also like to welcome Professor George, and thank you for moderating tonight. And so our lovely panelists, first we have Cierra Kaler-Jones, PhD. She is the first ever executive director of Rethinking Schools, which is an amazing resource. If you have not checked it out, please do. That's not an official part of the bio, but I had to add it. Rethinking Schools is the nation's leading grassroots publisher for racial and social justice in education. She serves on the Zinn Education Project leadership team and the Black Lives Matter at School Steering Committee. As a dance and arts educator, she's taught for 12 years in community-based and K-12 schooling spaces. Her research focuses on creating and sustaining educational spaces that refute policing and control and center liberation and joy. Cierra earned her PhD in education from the University of Maryland, College Park. Thank you, Cierra, for joining us. Next up, we have Bryan Cockrell. Bryan has taught English for multilingual learners for over 5 years, first in the Bronx and now in Wheaton, Maryland. He believes in the classroom as a space to prefigure the world we want and strives to create a community where students, their languages, and their cultures are affirmed. Before becoming a teacher, he trained in anthropology and archaeology and worked at Dumbarton Oaks and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, studying the innovations of metallurgical communities of practice in Central and South America. Welcome, Bryan. Let's see, next up is Jessica. Jessica Sutter is Chief of Civic Learning Initiatives at the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. She spent a decade as president of EdPro Consulting, where she managed projects and authored research for organizations, including the DC Public Charter School Board, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Center for Reinventing Public Education. Sutter recently served for 4 years as the Ward 6 representative on the DC State Board of Education, closing out her term as president of the board. She previously worked for both the Office of the State Superintendent of Education and Deputy Mayor for Education in Washington, DC, and she began her career as a middle school civics teacher. Sutter holds a BA in Political Science from Loyola College in Maryland and an MA and PhD in Education Policy from University of Maryland, College Park. When not talking civic education with students, teachers, and anyone who will listen, she can be found swimming, biking, and running her way around DC. Welcome, Jessica. And last, we have Amber Koonce. Amber is an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, LDF, where she litigates human rights and civil rights matters, including affirmative action, prison conditions, and desegregation. While at LDF, Amber has represented Nicole Hannah-Jones in her tenure dispute with the University of North Carolina, challenged the Trump administration for its prohibition on certain diversity and inclusion trainings, and represented the NAACP in its support of UNC's race-conscious admission process. Prior to joining the Legal Defense Fund, Amber maintained an active pro bono practice as a litigation associate at the international law firm Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, LLP. Amber also previously clerked for the Honorable William A. Fletcher on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and worked as a Luce Scholar for the Humanitarian Legal Assistance Foundation in the Philippines. Amber received her JD from Yale Law School and her BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Welcome, Amber. So I am going to stop talking and let our wonderful panel do its work. I would also encourage folks to follow us on our various social media. And if you're into tweeting or whatever we call it now, you're using the hashtag EDTR speaker series. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over and let folks get to it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kristen, for that introduction. And thanks everyone for coming out on a rainy Friday afternoon. We really appreciate it. Before getting into questions, I just want to do a couple more thank yous. Thank you to some racial equity and education law and policy clinic folks, including our supervising attorney, teaching fellow, Sophia Tan, a few of our students, Ayana Gaines, Riley Smith, former clinic student Isabel Miller, and thank you for all the master's students who have joined us as well. One of my colleagues, Professor Charisma Howe, who's on this side as well, who heads up the street law program at Georgetown Law, which is over 50 years old this year. And Gina Chirino with the National Coalition on School Diversity, who is a client/collaborator with the clinic. So thank you all again for joining us for this discussion. I also want to thank Wes Yoder, who is doing our sign language interpretation today. Appreciate that. And also folks who handle the logistics of getting us together, and Musica and Rami Andil, who is our the Brill Clinic's office manager. Okay, you all, so let's take a look. So according to the American Library Association, there were nearly 700 attempts to ban library books in the first 8 months of 2023. From January 1st to August 31st, the attempts sought to challenge or censor 1,915 titles, a 20% increase from the year 2022. And I've also been seeing in the news some recent talk about the Scholastic Book Fair. This is aging me a little bit. Some of you folks have no idea what the Scholastic Book Fair is, but that was a big deal as a kid when the Scholastic Book Fair came to your school, but apparently they are complying with some of these censorship provisions. According to the Legal Defense Fund, and I'm just sharing a quote from one of the attorneys there, classrooms are being used as a cudgel to silence voices and deny the experiences of Black people and other historically marginalized groups. So I think the first question for panelists will be if you can share with the audience a little bit more about the work that you do in your current role. You all have very different positions, but how do you situate your work in relationship to this current political climate? And I'll start with Cierra since you're closest to me.
Thank you. Very much looking forward to this conversation, and thank you all so much for being here. As the executive director at Rethinking Schools, my main role is to help vision and provide strategic opportunities for the organization to be in as many classrooms, as many policy spaces as possible. And so Rethinking Schools, we are an advocacy organization, but we are also a publisher of racial and social justice. And as an educator, of course, I had to bring a prop. So I wanted to bring our quarterly magazine. And one thing that's really special that makes our work different from any other racial and social justice publisher in education is that we center first person narratives. And so connecting that to what's currently happening right now, a lot of my work is in storytelling for social justice, because I do believe that the stories that we tell ultimately shape our beliefs and values that influence our actions and then impacts whether or not we uphold or dismantle the status quo. And so what we're seeing on the opposition side is they have co-opted a narrative. They've taken terms like critical race theory, a deeply rooted, historical, important field of study, and they've weaponized it and co-opted it. And so what does it mean on our side, the folks that are in service of social and racial justice, to be able to provide an affirmative vision? And so a lot of what we publish in our magazine, in our books, is the firsthand accounts of teachers, of students, of parents, organizers, activists, to say this is what these are the possibilities. This is what classrooms can look like. This is our dream for the future, and providing something that people can hold tangibly, because it's really hard to try to imagine things without that blueprint. And so we try to provide that in our materials. In addition, one of our projects that we co-coordinate with Teaching for Change, which is actually a DC-based organization, is the Zen Education Project. So we provide free downloadable people's history lessons for educators. And we have a number of campaigns, which I'll talk about throughout the course of our panel, but we have the Teach Truth campaign. So really, again, providing the affirmative. What do we want people to do? We want them to teach the truth about history, regardless of the law. Teaching climate justice, teaching for Black lives, and ensuring that we're really centering the humanity. We're sending stories of justice, joy, power, solidarity, and liberation.
Like Cierra said, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to be part of this panel. And also we are grateful as educators to have the blueprint that you provide through Rethinking Schools and through the Zen Ed. I know we draw on those resources frequently. I feel, thinking about not only the current political climate, not only the book bans, but also, as we know, the ongoing and historic attacks on Gaza that we know are happening now. I feel like as my role as educator is to empower people to think critically and to also provide a model of having an opinion, taking a stand, and recognizing the dangers of neutrality. I feel in my role as an English language development teacher, where I'm working with many students who this is their first few weeks, months, years in the United States, that I want to create a welcoming, affirming space for people who have undertaken a radical act of resistance in crossing borders, artificial borders, and in many cases, perhaps working to send funds to families and loved ones abroad. That's a radical act. And to recognize that they need a place, they deserve a place that is affirming, to greet them at the door, to at the end of the class, to carry them on to the next chapter of their day. That entrance and exit, the welcome, is so vital. When people come into our classroom, when people leave, like recently a student has moved away from our school, to recognize that we have somehow changed because of their absence, and we are different because of a new person's their presence, but we are still an evolving community. I'm thinking in terms of specific books that I want to provide access 2 books that have been banned and that I feel fortunate are part of our curriculum, like The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo and All American Boys, which we do read. And so to me, it's vital to provide that access, while at the same time recognizing that there might be other educators of multilingual learners who see those books as being too demanding or at a higher level of English language proficiency than their students are at the moment. But I feel they deserve access to this rich, demanding literature, and it's my role to help them get to that level, because those texts open up new worlds and visions for them. Thank you. Of course.
So my new role is still new-ish. I've been in my current role as the Chief of Civic Learning Initiatives for just about a year at the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. And something to know about where I work, it used to be called the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. And 4 years ago, we changed our name because we also changed our mission. The foundation has always been focused on solving the greatest challenges of talent that face the nation. When it was founded, it was designed to help returning GIs who were going to use the GI Bill to go to college, who was going to teach them. So there was an effort to take returning soldiers with higher ed degrees to go into teaching in academic settings so that we had enough professors to serve all the folks coming back from World War II. Right now, the greatest crisis facing America, I would argue, is democracy. Are we going to sustain it? Are we going to train young people to be ready to participate in it? So the Institute for Citizens and Scholars decided to focus our effort on ensuring that the 42 million young people ages 14 to 24 are ready to be empowered, engaged, lifelong citizens. We think that means that they have to have the civic knowledge, the civic engagement, and the commitment to democracy in order to do that. We couldn't ensure that every young American was able to do that if we kept the name of a man who didn't believe in the full humanity of Black and brown people. So change the name. Job is new to me, but my role is on our research field building work, which is basically, what do we know about how well prepared young people currently are? Short insight, they're not very well prepared. We released some survey data last month that I'll talk a little bit about during today's panel. And then we have to figure out, well, how do we do this work? We can't reach 42 million young people alone. Who can work with us? Who else is in the field? How are people assorting themselves in the field to do the work of preparing young people as citizens? But I come to this work as a K-12 educator. I was a middle school social studies teacher, I've been a teacher, a policy wonka consultant, a researcher, an elected member of a board of education. And when I was on the DC State Board, I spent my 4 years trying to make sure that we revised very outdated social studies standards in DC. When I came to DC as a middle school social studies teacher in 2006, we had brand new standards. When I ran for the Board of Education in 2018, we had the same standards. That's not good. So I'm proud to say that right after I left the board, my colleagues on the board voted to adopt brand new social studies standards that I'll talk more about later today. I'll say one challenge in my current work in this climate is that all of my past work as a teacher and elected, I would have said, is deeply rooted in equity and efforts to focus on marginalized communities. Our current work, because it is pro-democracy, has to work across the political spectrum with anyone who cares about democracy. So to be clear, we're not working with people who don't care about and don't value democracy, who may call themselves members of one party or another, but we're actually focused on saying, we can't take a side partisan-wise on this conversation. If you bring everyone who cares about sustaining democracy to the table to make this work, which also means working on civil discourse across lines of difference. Not easy to do, I think, in the current climate. Not easy to do if we ban books.
Thank you. Thank you.
So first I want to say thank you for bringing us all together today. Just really honored to be here in conversation with all of you. My name is Amber Koonce. I'm an assistant counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. It's our nation's premier racial justice legal organization. And I would say now in this political climate, I would frame it as we're experiencing a tremendous backlash to a lot of the racial justice progress that's been made. And at its heart, at its core, it's an anti-Black movement. So even though I'm a civil rights generalist, and I came to LDF thinking I would be doing like a mixed bag of civil rights work, which I am, a lot of my cases, because of this hotbed frontier of civil rights at the moment have been education-based. And have dealt with, I heard the word truth coming up, have dealt with trying to push back against mistruths or censorship that's happening. So I worked on the amicus brief for the NAACP and the UNC affirmative action case. As a graduate of UNC, a Black graduate of UNC, we thought it was important to highlight that UNC did not admit its first Black students until 1957. Right, so you have a Supreme Court that's saying the educational benefits of diversity is no longer a compelling interest of the government. At the same time, the school just integrated in 1957. Moreover, at LDF, I still work on active desegregation cases that Black families brought on behalf of their children because their school districts didn't desegregate willfully after Brown. So you have the Supreme Court tinkering with affirmative action. At the same time, that cases brought after Brown to force their school districts to integrate still have not yet been finalized. And that, I think, speaks to the censorship of history that's happening. Because folks don't know that context. And ultimately, I think that's what's at the core of this movement is to erase and silence a lot of the history, right? Tinkering with affirmative action while preventing students from being able to learn about why we needed affirmative action in the first place. We also at our organization have a campaign called Pro Truth, where we're looking at these states where they have these harmful bills and harmful laws coming out that are censoring students and censoring teachers in the classroom. And we're finding that what has traditionally been, a civil rights law firm, we're having to do a multi-pronged approach to attack this because folks are using a multi-pronged approach to get their desires through. And so we're working with community organizers and grassroots organizations. We're working with policy folks and then our litigators where necessary to try to push back against these laws, against these book bans.
Wow, great work that everyone is doing. And I appreciate a lot of the issues that you all raised. Amber, you talked about backlash, which so in the clinic, we use a critical race theory approach for understanding these laws, right? These policies that censor really truthful content, as you all noted. And we recognize that we are in a time of retrenchment, right? Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the originators of critical race theory, talked about race reform and retrenchment, right? When we have these moments of progress that are quickly followed by backlash in the form of retrenchment restrictions. So, I think of Reconstruction redemption, massive resistance following Brown, and now following increased political participation of people of color, Trump, the insurrection, and now these kind of restrictions. So this is my next question, and I think you all have hinted at this as well. What is the harm of these kind of bans, right? These kind of efforts to censor and control what happens in classrooms. I want to start with Bryan. And Bryan, you flagged one of your goals as an educator is to teach your students critical thinking, right? So what is the harm of these kind of censorship efforts?
Well, I think approaching it from the local context that I'm in, I think a harm of it is the potential for complacency, where I teach, people might say, well, there aren't book bans that are being proposed in the district that or other places around the US. People may say, like, it's not happening here. But my worry is that we do need to be prepared for fascist attacks on literature, on learning. And I think that was made clear at the school that I'm at. Unfortunately, last year, there was fascist anti-Black graffiti scrawled in a student bathroom. We were not proactive, and we did not obviously prevent that from happening. We were reactive, but we need to think, how can we together prepare and transform these conditions so that it doesn't happen again? I also feel that I encourage people to peel back the layer on curricula and see what's there. So when in the curricula that I've seen for All American Boys, which as you may know, is a story focused on policing and challenging white supremacy, challenging policing in America. Yet the curricula that I've seen that I've been encouraged to use in some contexts focuses on the violence within interpersonal relationships and kind of reduces, while stereotyping is an important subject for students to analyze, it reduces systems to stereotypes when there isn't that analysis of systems of oppression. So to me, when teaching students critical thinking, I want to broaden, Amber mentioned context, like provide that historical context so that these texts don't exist in a vacuum. There's a reason why the authors created this text, and for us to think, well, how might this apply to our lives and how might we change the conditions in which we live?
So I'm going to take it up a little bit to a systems level, which is that I worry that politically driven book bans, efforts to censor what's taught in classrooms, are actively anti-democratic. Democracy is rooted in freedom of expression and the free exchange of ideas, and that includes ideas I may personally, even vehemently disagree with. But to have access to those ideas, to be able to engage with those ideas, are really important. I mentioned the survey that we recently ran at the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. We called it the Civic Outlook of Young Adults in America. We surveyed 4,000 young people in a nationally representative survey, 18 to 24. We asked a lot of different questions, but one I think speaks to this. We asked about trust, and we said, how much trust, if any, do you have in the following persons and institutions? And we asked about media, we asked about government, we asked about their own generation, Gen Z, we asked about other generations. Anyone want to guess who had the highest level of trust? What kind of institution or group of persons for these young people? It was schools, colleges, universities, schools, libraries, and educators. If we allow the banning of books in places that our young people trust, that trust is going to decrease. And right now, levels of institutional trust in any institutions are at historic lows. So we want to maintain the trust that they have in institutions of education. And I think banning books really runs counter to that. I'll say from my old state board hat and my work on the social studies standards, one thing we explicitly centered in the redesign of those standards was giving young people access to windows and mirrors, both ways to see themselves reflected in the standards content and ways to see worlds beyond their own. If we ban or censor the content of the curricula, we close those doors, we close those windows, and that works against actively, I think, what schools and institutions should be trying to do for young people.
Thank you. Pam?
Yeah, I think one of the themes that we're seeing censored the most is like a text that speaks to systemic inequality, or the word equity is a dirty word now, systemic racism. And my personal concern is that with the censorship or the erasure of a discussion about systems in a country that operated under a caste system until 1964, without discussion of those systems, they are at risk of replication or not forced to change. And then for the little minds in the classrooms who are no longer having access to books that discuss these systems or teach these systems, they may see the outcomes of these systems and think that they just resulted from personal choices. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, especially if we're going to be serious about trying to have a multiracial democracy after being a caste system for so long. We have to educate. South Africa knew that with their Truth and Reconciliation project. Like we have to have the truth part thoroughly fleshed out, and we have to teach. And my concern with these book bans is that censoring painful histories, covering them up, framing them in a way that's not truthful will hinder us in our ultimate pursuit of a thriving multiracial democracy.
Thank you, Amber. Cierra?
Yes. One of the principles that I guide my life by is the Ghanaian principle of Sankofa. So it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind or go back and get it. And I think that that can absolutely be applied to what we're experiencing, because you have to know your history in order to know who you are as a person in the present, to be able to dream new futures. And part of what these bans and the censorship is trying to do is so that we can't dream new futures. And that I could go into my capitalism rant too about how the current workforce doesn't actually create space for us to dream, but that's another conversation for another day. But with that, we could go all the way back to Reconstruction, the one and only time that we've ever seen anything close to a multiracial democracy, and how white supremacists literally and figuratively burned it down. And so if we know that history and we see that pattern throughout history, we also not only learn that this is something that we've experienced many times before. I mean, we could even look at McCarthyism to what's happening right now with teachers. And we see not only the patterns, but we also learn the strategies. We learn what we could do differently. We're able to analyze and critically engage with that history to be able to reframe our own strategies now. And there are so many things about this current moment that is scary to me, but with the censorship, I think about how they have taken this umbrella and put everything under it. So there's legislation banning social emotional learning. So we can't learn about ourselves and relationships with others and understand the world around us. There's anti-civics education. I mean, in places like Oklahoma, they have legislation that's moving that's saying that students can't get any type of credit and shouldn't engage in any type of civic engagement or lobbying or activism. There's over 155 anti-LGBTQ+ bills that are happening right now. And so, Christopher Rufo, who has been really at the helm of this demonization of critical race theory, has called it a brand that they're taking and putting everything under. And so what they are doing is evoking fear. And fear is one of the easiest stories to sell, right? And so making people feel fearful so that they don't rise up. And I think that that's very aligned with what I'm experiencing right now with teachers that I'm having conversations with. So we just did a feature of Melissa Temple, who is in Waukesha, Wisconsin, who was recently terminated for having her students sing Rainbow Land by Dolly Parton and Miley Cyrus. And she has actually taken her case to federal court, but we're hearing from many teachers who are highly regarded, well-respected, loved by students and parents, where a parent from another district comes into their district, causes an uproar at the Board of Education meeting, and all of a sudden this very well-respected teacher is being fired. And so part of this fear is also a chilling effect on teachers to make teachers not teach the truth and to not create inclusive classrooms for their students, which is aimed at a much larger effort about dismantling our democracy, if you want to call it that, shape democracy, but also so that the trust that Jessica is talking about, so that there is actually not trust in public education, so that they can go and privatize everything. And so there are so many layers to the current moment that are intersecting. And I think part of teaching and learning this history allows us to see the intersections of all of the pieces that are currently moving.
Wow, thank you all so much for sharing that. And I really like Jessica, when you noted windows and mirrors, right? What learning about history of others and ourselves can do for us, right? And I absolutely agree. It is a denial of learning about systemic inequality. It is an effect to effort to have a chilling effect, right, on educators. And this is a time when we're experiencing teacher shortages, right? And we have educators who want to learn about these issues, who want to teach about them, because a lot of the children want to learn about them as well, right? And so it really is a widespread effort to stifle truth, right? Truth and equality. And that's why we start in the clinic talking about history, because understanding the history, understanding how so many of the inequities we see today have actually been constructed, they've been designed. That's so critical to understanding how inequality sustains itself and how it adapts. Unfortunately, white supremacy is extremely adaptable. It will morph, shapeshift, take on new forms, right? So speaking of which, those that are in support or pushing these book bans, what is the group? Moms for Liberty. By the way, this is a shameless plug, you all. I talk in a forthcoming paper, available on SSRN called, Deny, Defund, Divert, the Law on American Miseducation, about the correlations between these current anti-CRT laws and laws enacted during massive resistance. Look at the text, you all, they are so similar, right? In terms of what they try to do and what they try to stifle. And there were a lot of civic groups like Mothers, Moms for Liberty, y'all, that formed right during that time. There's a scholar, Elizabeth McRae. She's actually a professor at University of West Virginia who wrote a book called Mothers and Massive Resistance. And she talks about this orchestrated effort of white mothers to maintain and sustain segregation. Okay, so they're so well organized, clearly, right? So what do efforts of those of us who are trying to push back, who are trying to expose what these restrictions and these bans are trying to do, what do those efforts look like? How can we be effective? And I'm thinking for the master's students who are in the advocacy track, right? And folks who want to engage in policy work, how can we be how can we be just as effective in our messaging and in our work? And I'll start with Amber, and then we'll come back.
So I guess what I want to lift up is that there is a resistance and it is organized. Moms for Liberty gets a lot of attention and a lot of credit for being organized, but I do think it's important to know that they are outnumbered. And I wish that folks could see the amount of organization that's happening at the hyperlocal level, librarians organizing, teachers organizing, Black parents organizing, and students organizing themselves. We've seen this at LDF in our work throughout the South, that in a lot of these states, they had their own grassroots groups that are now coming together to form coalitions to speak out at school board meetings, because we saw a pattern of, Moms for Liberty groups would pick a day to speak at a meeting, and all the speakers would have the same position on a policy or on a book. And all the parents speaking would just happen to be white. But we know this isn't an all-white school district. And so then you have your Black parents, your parents of color getting together and organizing themselves to provide a greater perspective of all parents and what they think and how they feel. Teachers associations are coming together to strengthen each other, to support each other, and make sure teachers know that they're supported. And librarians are also pushing back and organizing in their own way. So I think that because a lot of these individuals work for the districts that are doing a lot of the censoring or restrictive policies and rules, the resistance doesn't get as much of a platform because of fear of retaliation. But I do think it's important to know that it's happening and that those folks are organizing. So that encourages me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll build on this because I think one of the things I hope to see us continue to build a better muscle around is the electoral side of that. So Moms for Liberty, in addition to speaking out at these school board meetings, is supporting folks to run for school boards and then endorsing candidates. And there are absolutely groups on the progressive side, on the anti-racist side, that are actively working to generate interest and effort to recruit candidates. There is not yet a single place where you're going to find that same endorsement in the way that you're seeing with Moms for Liberty. And I'll say, as someone who ran for a Board of Education slot here in Washington, D.C., which is a very different political environment than what we're talking about. But even in DC, where our Board of Education elections are held on the same cycle as other elections, right? So some members of the board are elected on cycle with the mayor, others are elected off mayoral cycle, but on cycle with the council. That's not the case in most of America. School board elections are not only down the bottom of the down ballot races, like you often have to flip over your ballot to find the school board races. In lots of places, they're held on another day. They're held on like the third Tuesday in April. And so they're not generating the same attention for folks to come out and vote for them, which means you're getting hyper-organized folks, not only seeking to agitate at school board meetings, but seeking to stack school boards with people who think like them, who they are funding, who they are endorsing. I think we need to build that same organizing muscle in the resistance angle to say, You gonna run for school board? You gonna help support a school board candidate? Are you gonna knock on doors? Are you gonna put out signs? Are you gonna make sure that you get out the vote? Are you gonna be there on election day to make sure that folks in your town get to the polls and do this work? So I would say if any of you have ever thought about running for office, do it. Consider running for a board of education. It's a powerful place where a lot of decisions get made. And they often get made by a very small number of people, often in darkness, or with only the loudest, best organized voices who get heard again and again. So that's my my pitch.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to skip to Cierra and then we'll round out.
So just to echo and reiterate, there's so much resistance that's happening, everything from the individual level to some local level, state level, national level. I think of a couple of stories in particular. I was in conversation with an educator in Massachusetts who got notification from her school district that because she had a Black Lives Matter poster that came from our magazine up in her classroom, that she would face termination, or she would face additional backlash from the school. So she reached out to us for that conversation. And she basically was like, yeah, I'm not taking that poster down. I don't care what they do. I don't care what they say. And so I'm seeing a lot of that resistance from individual teachers that are being like, I'm going to close my door and I'm going to teach what I need to teach because I don't care what you have to say. And then I'll get legal support afterwards if I need to. So shout out to the legal folks for helping out the educators. And then I think about some of the work that we've been doing at Rethinking Schools and it's an education project and Black Lives Matter at School. We've been convening Teach Truth Days of Action for the past couple of years. And with the Teach Truth Days of Action, we have been encouraging people to hit a historic site in their community and show up same day, same time, and then publicly pledge to teach the truth regardless of the law, and or to publicly pledge to support teachers for teaching the truth. And we've seen hundreds of people come together on those days of action, very vocal, talking to media, having their stories heard. And as we were talking about sharing those stories and how those stories get suppressed, I mean, the corporate media does a really great job at not sharing the individual stories of the resistance. And so I think that that's something we need to think about too, is holding journalists accountable for telling the whole truth and telling the full story and telling these stories of resistance. At Rethinking Schools, we also have a number of study groups. So over the past couple of years, we've had over 300 study groups across the country of people studying our both Teaching for Black Lives, both looking at in the classroom, what does it actually look like and what does it mean to teach for Black lives, but also at the school level. And we've seen people in those study groups then go to their school district and advocate for more equitable, more just policies, which has been really powerful and really beautiful to see. So at both ends, we see those school communities, we see the individual educators coming together. There's also just so much organizing happening across the country to really think about and to push back on this legislation.
Thank you, Bryan.
So building on what's been said, I was thinking about about building these coalitions across differences. I'm thinking back to last year, a member of our student government association at our school really made this point to me that was very inspiring, and I want to carry forward, which is that how might teachers and students who often get pitted against each other, how might we recognize what we have in common and build empathy across these differences? We're in the same school, we're in the same building, we're often subjected to unfairness when it comes to the facility itself, the schedule. Many of us were always commenting on how exhausted we are. How might we build solidarity across these differences in that very local context of the school? Also thinking about forming new generations of writers, authors, storytellers, building on Cierra's point of that storytelling as a critical component of resistance, and the students themselves being empowered to write stories that are affirming and inclusive, to counter those efforts to ban books. So I want to provide spaces so that students are crafting these stories so that we have these inclusive stories for many generations to come.
Wow, thank you all so much. So Cierra, you mentioned the Teaching for Black Lives book, right? Which is phenomenal. If folks can get a hold of that. Can you each share some examples from your work, similar examples about that you've leveraged in the classroom, how you've leveraged in the classroom, curriculum towards racial justice and social justice, whether it's a book like that or innovative lessons or things that you do? And we'll start this time with Jessica.
Sure. So I'm gonna lean heavily on my social studies work with the state board and just celebrate our standards for a few minutes, because not just the content, but the process of creating those new standards is absolutely one of the most proud moments in my career to date. Like 25 years in public education, getting these standards revised, incredibly proud of that, because as an elected official, I had constituents in Ward 6, but for the work of revising 14-year-old standards, the constituency that I had to respond to was every child in our system in our city, every educator working in all of our schools, and all of their families. Like, what did you envision for what you want your children to know in history, in civics, in politics? So how would we do that was a really complicated process across two agencies, the state board and our state superintendent's office, but also across community. We included an advisory panel to the state board that had 2 students on it, as well as parents and educators, folks who wrote curriculum, to make sure that it wasn't just 9 elected representatives who had all of our own ideas about what we wanted to change in the standards, but rather a representative sample of the city who said to us, here's what we care about. And I'll tell you, the students we had, dynamic and fantastic and always very vocal in here's what we believe we deserve to have access to knowing. So that was part of the design of what should change in the standards. Students were also involved in the actual rewriting of the standards. And then when the standards were voted on, they'd gone through multiple revisions, there were access to public feedback. There were 4 student members of the board who also had access to vote on those approval of those standards. So the standards are now genuinely a product of, from, by, and for the children of DC. And to me, that's powerful in terms of what comes of that in terms of the curriculum that gets written. The new standards have increased coverage of DC history across all of K-12, not just in high school. And for a city that is disenfranchised in Congress, having DC history be centered in the curriculum is really important for the young people who grow up here. Increased content in Black history, LGBTQ+ history, women's history, the history of immigrant groups in DC, and a less Eurocentric focus in our world history are also in the new standards. An added action civics course in middle school. And maybe most important, though it's not in the standards, we have for the first time, certainly since the State Department of Education was created in 2007, a full-time staff person at the state superintendent's office whose job it is to support the implementation of the standards with the LEAs and their educators. I know that sounds silly, like one person for the whole city, but before that we had no one who dealt with social studies at the state superintendent's office. So if you thought, well, do they care about it? Not if they don't have any staff for it. So now they have a full-time staff person, and the state board also has a standards-based staff person. So to me, while it's not a specific text, this evolution of the standards, both the process and where they landed, is a place where I feel like we did a lot of work in DC, and there still stands to be a lot of work to make sure that curriculum is reflected of those guiding standards.
Thank you. So we'll jump over here. We'll do Cierra, Bryan, Amber. Let's start with Cierra.
So one thing that I do outside of my work at Rethinking Schools is I co-run a youth organizing fellowship here in DC. So I support youth organizers. It's really important to me to stay connected to young people and to continue to listen to them, and not just listen, but actually take action towards what feedback that they're giving. And one thing that we've done together in the Youth Organizing Fellowship is really recommitted to teaching about joy. I think that that's really important, because I don't know about y'all, but I am exhausted. And that's just me being real and me being candid. Because everything that we are fighting against on a daily basis, we need to sustain ourselves. And that's by design, right? Part of the push and part of the backlash is also to physically, mentally, emotionally deplete us so that we have nothing left to fight. So we were really big on centering joy. And so we had this lesson, we call it Joyful Leaders, where there was this Twitter thread where people were sharing pictures of Black civil rights activists and in current and historical context doing everyday things. So it was Martin Luther King Jr. riding a bike, Martin Luther King Jr. eating pizza, Fannie Lou Hamer walking down the street with her husband, Rosa Parks doing yoga, James Baldwin dancing, like doing everyday joyful things. And so we print out the pictures, we put them on the wall, and then we put a sticky note over their name and just ask students to go around and say, you know, do you know who this is? What are they doing? Have you ever seen this picture of them? And some pictures were in color too, right? Some were in black and white, some were in color. And they had so many thoughtful, reflective responses to say, well, we never see these pictures in our textbooks. And so we had a conversation about why. Why do we never see these pictures of people that are activists and organizers that have been doing this work? Why don't we see them being everyday human beings? And so what the students ultimately said to us was that it is powerful because they leave social studies, they leave history class, and they just feel so angry. But then they see these pictures and they're like, wait a minute. You know, Martin Luther, and this is what the student said to me, he said, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't wake up and was like, fight, 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 struggle, struggle, struggle. Like he actually did other things. We're like, yeah. So you see the humanity in the organizers and in the activists. And then you also see that they were everyday, ordinary people like each and every one of us. And a lot of this, this hero myth that Julian Bond talks about is we lift up these figures in history and think, oh, well, somebody will rise up and just save us. They'll come up out of nowhere. But then that just completely disrupts and dismantles and takes the onus away from the everyday people and the stories of solidarity, the stories of struggle, the stories of community, and the stories of collective resistance that have always been the fuel to get us inches closer to freer futures. And so that's what I like to do, is just find new and innovative ways to encourage joy and to also teach the full truth. And teaching the full truth to me means teaching about joy and teaching about how that relates to justice.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. That's so important, the onus on the individual person, on the everyday people. I'm thinking about a few examples. Sometimes I worry that a text that we're asked to teach, like A Raisin in the Sun, we're asked to teach it in a very decontextualized manner. But to me, it's important that we recognize that A Raisin in the Sun would not exist if we didn't have the context in which it was written, if we didn't know about the life of Lorraine Hansberry. And so I asked my students to listen to an audio recording of her talk on the Black Revolution and the White Backlash, to really see the political context out of which this text comes, and to recognize like that she herself and her collaborators were saying, like, this story is not a universal story, though it's often interpreted in that way, that they want people to see specific context, that this is a Black family on the south side of Chicago in the mid-20th century, and to appreciate that context. I also, when we talk about the American dream in America, for students who this is their first few weeks and months in the US, we listen to the performance by Janel of their song Americans, where the idea is, how do we grapple with loving a place while also critiquing it? It's possible to do those things at once. I'm also thinking about, I've taught a Latin American history course where we explore the work of the Young Lords and their intersection with the Black Panthers and their creation of a Patient's Bill of Rights that led us in class to have students develop their own Know Your Rights trainings. And so students have explored, what are my rights in the workplace? So many students are working long hours. What are my rights when if I go to a protest or encounters with cops or with ICE? This is so vital. It's not part of the curriculum, but it's so essential. And so I have students training each other in what their rights are. And then lastly, I'll say that it's important for me for students to also see organizations that exist beyond the school. So in New York, we worked with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project for students to identify places of power in their community. Here in the DMV, I've had students meet with the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador to look at what does solidarity mean and how might I stay connected to people in another country and for us to fight for each other across these borders.
Wow. Yeah, well, I want to say thank you to our teachers. I'm not in the
Yes.
classroom. So what I can say is that something that when we were trying to figure out what is our role in protecting the curriculum, that's advancing racial justice, is there's a lot of fear mongering going on around social emotional learning or culturally responsive teaching. So, you know, and being stretched outside of our litigation arm, we thought about like, we need to provide folks with fact sheets, information about what actually is social emotional learning, what are the outcomes of this type of curriculum, and what are the outcomes of a culturally responsive, you know, lesson plan that a teacher's implementing. So we've kind of made it a part of our job to generate educational resources and informational resources to push back against a lot of the fear mongering that's going on around these different curricula that teachers are trying to.
Thank you all so much. Those are powerful examples. I'll share one thing we do in the Real Policy Clinic. We think about, Bryan actually made me think about this. So we have to learn the rules of professional, well, we call them professional conduct, professional responsibility, et cetera, which are not the most exciting thing on earth, but we assign the students an essay by Purvi Shah, who's a movement lawyer, about these rules and have them come up with their own code of, what did we call it? We didn't call it rules of professional responsibility. I can't even remember what we called it, something else. Code of conduct, something. What would govern that? Their own guiding principles, I think we call it. Guiding principles. Students, you're in trouble for not remembering. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But like guiding principles, right, that would guide them throughout the semester in their practice, right? And so they came up with more proactive, right? Instead of thinking the lawyer shall not do X, Y, and Z, what will you proactively do? What kind of collaboration or relationship with your clients will you proactively pursue? So you all, we've talked about the work that you're doing. We've talked about how a lot of the resistance has not been acknowledged, right? But what barriers and obstacles have you faced in doing this work? And we'll start with Cierra, and then we'll go through the panel.
Sure. So as a nonprofit leader, one thing that is always a challenge is fundraising. We're always trying to raise money because we can't do the work without investment in the people power. We can't do the work without investment in the program. So that's certainly something that's always the top of my mind. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it because it's something that I think about daily. But I think just the number of educators that come to Rethinking Schools as a resource, not only looking for support and community, but for looking for hope and for inspiration, especially as so many of their colleagues and peers leave the classroom or are terminated. I think that that's a huge challenge. But another challenge that I'll name that we've been experiencing, particularly over the past couple of weeks, is the external backlash that often comes. We get a lot of emails, we get a lot of hate emails, we get a lot of hate messages on social media that say some very scary and unfortunate things. And so having to have that, weigh on your heart is, I think, something that contributes to the weight of the work, is trying to continue to do what we need to do, regardless of the backlash, and continuing to push forward. But that's something that's always on top of mind. So for example, in addition to the Teach Truth Days of Action, we have a Teach Truth Pledge that's available online that educators have signed. A conservative outlet took the pledge and organized the pledge by state, school district, and name. And so you could go into this database that they created, and school districts were going on there and letting teachers know, I saw that you said that you would break the law. And so you could lose your job, you could be terminated. And so we see an enhanced microscope on our work now. There's always been a microscope, but particularly now people are looking for any possible way to bring about backlash. And we've had editors that are on our editorial board. People have gone to their houses, found their addresses. And so for us, it's also a matter of safety. I think safety is a huge challenge, particularly in progressive social justice movements. If, part of doing this work is also risking some of our safety and continuing to push forward. So I think that one thing for us to continue to hold in our hearts is just the power of community, the power of solidarity. So leaning into one another, looking to other folks to really provide that community support, because nobody else is coming to save us except for ourselves. So we really have to lean on one another for that support.
I'm sorry that you go to the point, but that's terrific. I'm thinking about a barrier, a major barrier, I would say, is that while we're experiencing positive efforts towards building schools that prioritize restorative justice and transformative justice, we're still operating. I know my school district and other school districts are operating also within a punitive framework, and we're still connected to the prison industrial complex. Suspensions are still happening. I feel that is a barrier. It has the potential to remove people from our community who deserve a place and have a place in our community. And I think a major part of that is standardized testing, which is ongoing, and I've never seen it as much as it's happening this year, where there are so many interruptions. And I really strive for students to understand the full artistic statement of authors, for us to read whole books. And some of these books are books that have been banned in other places, yet because of so many interruptions from these tests, it's simply not possible. It's a struggle. And so to me, for example, a couple of weeks ago, the PSAT, I guess the whole college board system across the nation crashed. We weren't able to take it at our school. We're going to have to redo it next Wednesday, but this really just takes time away. So that would be one dream I have, is to cancel these standardized tests, because we as teachers, we can determine, we're experts in determining our students' proficiency, and please trust us to determine that level and work with the students without the need for these standardized tests.
So it builds on what Cierra was saying about funding. I think is inherent as well in the work that we do at Citizens and Scholars. We're also a nonprofit, we're not endowed. So it's the same sort of notion. But I think getting time and attention for civic education, for the social studies, for anything that is not reading and math and science, notably the tested subjects, is really tough. And it's both the biggest barrier in my current work, which is on the survey I mentioned earlier, we asked a 4-question civics quiz. Some very basic things, like a multiple choice question on which of these describes the content of the First Amendment, or what does the Electoral College do? Also a multiple choice question. 4% of 18 to 24-year-old surveyed got all 4 questions right. The vast majority got 1 right. Do you know the First Amendment? 80% of them know what the First Amendment says when given a multiple choice set of answers. But it's really hard to say, hey, civic knowledge, they don't have it, but also who has time to teach it? Where are they going to teach it? Who's going to give funding and attention for it to be taught? So I think time to get attention on it. And when you see things happening, like the doxing of people who are willing to teach the truth, it's really hard to convince folks that this is something that we should do in our polarized environment. Because again, it's easier to stay safe. It's easier to pull back from it. It's far easier for school leaders and school boards to say, you can't have this controversy, just stick to math. That's fine, less controversy there.
And I'll just, affirm that the politicization of this moment has been incredibly difficult to navigate, and has left a lot of people in fear of retaliation if they resist. I remember when that list came out from the opposition, it was very concerning, had a tremendous chilling effect. and they're using these kind of like fear tactics that are leaving messages, emails, etc. That has made the moment incredibly difficult. I'll also say, you know, in a lot of these like far-flung areas where you might be the only teacher who's willing to teach a certain way up against a broader community that disapproves, just making sure that people don't feel so isolated in this moment has been a barrier that, you know, we're trying to navigate and figure out how to deal with it. But that's, you know, it's definitely very real that, you know, you can have communities where most folks, you know, may be okay with certain things. And so just making sure folks who are in those situations where they may be the one who can be few, that they know that they're supported.
Well, thank you all for continuing the great work that you do despite these obstacles. So we have one last question and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. I think we have Professor Justin Hansford, who's a Georgetown law grad from Howard Law's Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Institute. Just want to give an acknowledgement. Thank you for joining us. I want to ask a closing question. Again, given these risks, given some of the obstacles, given some of the challenges we've discussed, what advice would you give to future educators, policymakers, advocates who are committed to racial justice? And I'm also going to take some liberty and add to this question. What gives you hope? What makes you hopeful? And we'll start this time with Bryan.
Yeah. So I think most of all, the advice I would have is to really believe in young people as being capable and ready to shape change. I'm thinking about something that gives me hope is working with students on theater of the oppressed, which many of you may know is a technique of practice where people identify a problem that exists. And so students in my class, they've chosen the problem of addiction or interpersonal violence or family struggles, racism. They choose a problem, they develop some type of scene, a theatrical performance where they enact the problem and potential solutions. And then there's the active participation of the audience in which they get involved in the scene, and also there's this negotiation where they play an active role in figuring out solutions. But to me, that is beautiful and empowering students to say, like, they can tackle these major global problems themselves and envision that world that they deserve. I also think that thinking again about that potential for complacency, I really encourage people to also set a high standard for curricula. So it's a lot of energy, of course, preparing and pushing back against fascist attacks on curricula and in book bans. But at the same time, I want to hold a very high standard for our curriculum, make sure we're not losing sight of how can we make this even more liberatory. How can we ensure that we're contextualizing these texts, empowering students to create their own visions of different worlds.
Thank you.
So my advice, this builds on something you said earlier, Cierra. The world is heavy, and I don't think it's going to get lighter anytime soon. My first year of teaching middle school, I was teaching in a Catholic school in the west side of Chicago. And my mentor teacher said to me, find one good thing in every day. And if you get to the end of the day and you haven't found it yet, go make it. For her, that often meant grabbing a kid and shooting some hoops at the end of the day just to say that there was a good thing that happened. But it's a thing I carry with me now, and I think it's important to what you were saying here to maintain the joy. For me, the thing that gives me hope is young people. I always feel smarter. I always feel more optimistic about the future when I speak to a middle school or a high school student. 2 weeks ago, our team got together in person in Princeton, and we had a high school student who'd been part of our Civic Spring Fellowship, a chance for young people 14 to 24 to get a small stipend and address a local problem in their community. And this high school student, Sam, came and said, well, you know, when I was at home during the pandemic, I was learning a lot about mutual aid work. It's something I hadn't been aware of before, but I learned about it and saw it happening in communities in Philadelphia. And then I got back to school and I've been learning all about the food waste that causes additional problems with climate change. And I thought, why don't we solve one problem with the other? Why don't we take our school's food waste that would at the end of the day be disposed of and put it in mutual aid fridges and create community markets and repurpose the food, take the bananas, make them into smoothies and give them out in the community at the end of the day. Sam now is the executive director of a nonprofit called Feeding Philly. Sam's a high school senior. And I watch this and I think, okay, all is not lost. There is something to come of this. And to me, that's what gives me hope.
That's incredible.
Yeah, Sam is my icon.
What gives me hope, I think I'm so passionate about giving folks opportunity to learn the correct and full history in which they're situated, because learning my history has given me hope. I feel like I felt the heaviest doing this work when I wasn't properly situating myself in the long trajectory of struggle. But you know, and I started properly learning my history, I would say, once I got to college and had access to an African American Studies department and, you know, books I didn't know about before. I started collecting oral histories of Black resettlement farmers in North Carolina, my grandparents who grew up under Jim Crow, et cetera. So learning their history, and which is my history, and situating myself in that and what they've been able to overcome. Whenever I start feeling like really heavy about where we are, and you know, even my grandfather said it feels like we're going backwards, which coming from him, I don't take that lightly because he has sipped from a colored water fountain. So it's helpful to know, like, okay, we've been there, we moved forward past it. If we're progressing now, we can move forward again, and that gives me hope.
Well, I think there are so many things that we can do, and I'll just reiterate some of what the panelists had shared. You know, like Jessica was talking about, run for school board if you can. A lot of decisions get made there. Write op-eds, write to local papers, write to national outlets, write as much as you can to be vocal about sharing your stories, about sharing these stories that are happening every day. Because part of what this is trying to do is not only erase history generally, but to erase our history. So if we put something down in print to be able to pass down, those in the future will be able to learn from what we are experiencing in our stories. So I definitely recommend that. I also say, get organized. If there is a local organizing group, there are many here in DC. I'm thinking about One DC as an example. DC Area Educators for Social Justice is out of Teaching for Change. They do a lot of great work every month, bringing educators and people invested in education together to have these conversations and to mobilize. So be a part of movements, learn about organizing strategies and tactics, because it's such a strategic praxis. Everything from base building to storytelling to you know, canvassing and campaigning, developing a campaign. All of those things will ultimately help us in the future as we continue to build on this work. And all of the things that you all mentioned absolutely give me hope. And I think about just my colleagues, my comrades, my friends in the work, and just long conversations. So surround yourself with people who love you. Surround yourself with people who also hold you lovingly accountable. Like James Baldwin said, because I love you, I have to make you conscious of all the things that you don't see. So surround yourself with people that'll call you out. And surround yourself with people that will love you through the times that they have to call you out, because we have to do individual work, because we've all been socialized into this really harmful, scary system. And so we all have work to do. So I say, do the work, surround yourself with people that love you, and then dance, find dance breaks. There's at least 15 minutes of every day. We turn on our favorite song, we dance with the dog, and we just gotta find those moments to lean into wellness, to lean into joy, because that's ultimately what will fuel the resistance.
Thank you. And if everyone can just join me in giving our fabulous panelists. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. We're a low-tech operation here, folks. So what you can do is maybe yell out and I'll repeat the question so folks can hear it through the mic. But if you can raise your, I didn't mean yell out, raise your hand and then then you can yell out the question. But any questions? I know this is so much information. Well, I'll start. Oh, yes, we have a question. We'll start here on the left and then in the back.
Civil rights. I wanted to know, what did you feel like you needed to get along?
Okay, so the question is for Amber. And the question is, you know, you work in civil rights right now. When did you feel like you needed to get a law degree? And that's coming from one of our masters.
That's an excellent question because there's a very specific answer. So I always knew I wanted to do racial justice work. I'm from North Carolina, grew up in the South, had really formative experiences with racism at a young age. So I knew I wanted to, specifically I wanted to deal with young people who were encountering racism. Initially, I thought, and I did a lot of organizing in high school, went into college, thought maybe I'll address these issues through policy. Did some of the NPP pre-policy programs that they have offered to you as a college student, was organizing in the North Carolina community. Now Reverend Barber, who I feel like everyone knows for the Poor People's Campaign, at the time he was our state NAACP president, and we were organizing, having Moral Mondays in North Carolina when I was in college and marching to the State House. We went from progressive state house with the Racial Justice Act, where we were, giving people second chances who had all white juries and sentenced to death, to an overrun, incredibly conservative state house that was just taking us backwards. And through that work, kind of seeing the pendulum swing while I was in college, made me realize that I wanted to have a tool that could produce something more durable, that at the time I didn't think would be swayed by politics, right? Law to me was the most durable form of change that in my pre-law school years, I was is not tainted as much by politics, but I now know. Yeah. So that's the very specific answer, right? We had a shift in the state house in North Carolina while I was in college, and I saw a lot of the work that I did with public assistance reform, voting access. We used to have a voting site on my college campus when I was in college. It's gone. All of that shifted in a matter of 4 years, right? I started college in 2008 when Obama was elected his first term. We stormed Franklin Street. So the shift was just, it was an incredibly expansive 4 years, and just made me realize that I want that law as a tool in my kid for change.
Thank you for that question. In the back.
Very much open to anyone who wants to respond to it. What would you say to people who careful with the word, what do you say to people who are going towards working in maybe a more conservative field while holding these views that really can't be openly expressed?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So this is for any panelists. What would you say to folks who are going in more conservative fields, hold these views, right? More progressive views, but don't feel like they can openly express those? Is that?
One thing I would recommend is finding your people and building those networks of solidarity. It's a brave act to do, but you can't do it alone. There are people out there, but to me, that's something I've struggled with. But there are those people, you just have to find them somehow. As Cierra was mentioning, there are so many organizations to plug into.
I think I would add one thing we talk about with work in civil discourse across lines of difference is entering spaces with an attitude of curiosity. So coming into a conservative space, but holding more progressive views, asking questions of the folks maybe who hold those more conservative views, to have them try to explain where they're coming from and why. I have found it interesting in some of the work we've done across the political spectrum. I find I have some shared values with people I would not have expected to hold shared values. And while it doesn't change my positioning or their positioning, it does open space for conversation that I might not have expected there to be. So I think in a tactical sense, entering with a space, an attitude of curiosity and asking questions that let people share more about why they sit where they do and what lies underneath that for them.
Yes, Isabel.
I'm part of the Georgetown street law program. So, so I'm teaching a class that's kind of an introduction to the law for high school students in DC right now. 2 months into teaching, so just standing in front of the classroom is still very new and overwhelming. So what's like the easiest, simplest first step that someone could take right now to make their classroom more inclusive and to incorporate some of these things into their lessons?
So the question, and this is for any panelist.
Yeah.
So for any panelist, what's a great first step that anyone can take to make their classroom more inclusive? Is that accurate, Isabel? Okay.
I would say my first step is always to just build relationships. Get to know the students, ask them what they like to do. I think in this past year, I've learned a lot more about soccer than I've ever known before. Just because I think it's so important to ask those questions, and then it starts to break down those barriers. I think in education, oftentimes when you may be coming into a space, and because of the way that we're taught, right, we're socialized into this system of schooling rather than it being education as a lifelong learning tool. But in the system of schooling, there's always been this hierarchy between student and teacher. And so when you start to ask those questions and you get to know your students, get to know what they like, then you can start to bring that into the curriculum. But then you also have those touch points with them where you can ask them, how's that soccer game turn out? Or how was that you did over the weekend? I know you were really excited when you told me about it last week, because then it helps them to see you as a partner in learning, but then it also helps you to figure out what they like and how to bring it into the space.
I think building on Cierra's response and thinking about recently in my 10th grade English class, there was this drive to really move on to this next part of our curricula. And this was the first time I was teaching this course, and I thought, Bryan, step back here. Like there's, in terms of building those relationships, in my other 9th grade classes, I invite students to do this all about me presentation, where they have an opportunity to be in front of all of us and tell their stories, and they create slides, multimedia. But that simple act, I said, we need to pause this because I never provided students that opportunity. And once I did, once they had the floor and they were up there and they had this presence in front of other people, the power of the classroom shifted. They felt what it was like to be in front of others. And I feel since then, the relationships have blossomed. Our community has transformed. So yeah, giving people that opportunity to speak, and we're all here, like we're the audience, and we have a role to listen and build connections with them. Afterwards, I had students share, like, how do you connect with them? What do you appreciate? What did you appreciate about their presentation? To build just a loving community.
Great ideas, great ideas. Up front here.
Yeah, so my question goes specifically to Jessica. You were talking about the change in the standards for the social studies curriculum, and I was very curious about it because I think that's a great step towards social justice, just learning all of those things. And I was just wondering, what are some struggles you have faced? Like, is there any situation, like we were talking about Moms for Liberty, is there like a counterpart that's like fighting that kind of thing? Because like talking about history, talking about LGBTQ, those are big issues that create a lot of confrontation. So I'm just wondering, how have you handled, like, if you know, like how's been the process? And then just one more thing that I wanted to know, because we were talking about the standards and talking about elementary. I work as an elementary teacher, and I'm just like thinking of like, how would that implementation go into like public schools, just bringing a whole new thing that is not being taught at all. So if you have any ideas of how that would work, or like what the future would look like.
So this question is for Jessica. This is a two-parter. First, opposition that you encountered, right, when in developing and implement or shaping these social studies standards, and then how to implement them, how to prepare teachers to teach these new standards.
So on the opposition question, there's sort of two stories I'll tell. One is when the standards were put out for public comment, when the draft standards were put out, we got lots of feedback, and the state board got some feedback, and then the state superintendent's office got feedback. And we did hear feedback that was objecting to some of the opening up of the standards, the more inclusivity, the specific inclusion of additional LGBTQ plus history, questions around words that are used in the standards. So we no longer use the word explorers, we use the word colonizers. That didn't sit very well for some folks. The reality of being in DC is that the feedback embracing the change far outweighed that feedback. And so it was possible to say, oh, most of the feedback says this is good, so we're going with that. But all the feedback was made public. So being clear about the opposition and making sure that folks have that voice and have that chance, I think, is one piece. And another story, when we were writing the guiding principles, this was the state board and our advisory committee. We called it the CISAC, the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. The CISAC put out 19 guiding principles, and we'd had a number of people who were part of the CISAC. One of those people wrote a piece of the guiding principles that noted why the old standards needed to be changed. And it said that the old standards were not actively anti-racist, and so they contained racist things. Another member of the advisory committee actively objected to that being the way we described why the standards had to be changed. It should be said that the person who objected had been part of the writing of the old standards and felt like we were calling those who wrote the standards racist. It's also important to note that the person who objected was a white woman, and the person who had written the statement was a Black woman. And waited until we got right down to the last day of the revisions. And there was a call that had to be made of, do we include this language or not? What would that say to all the people who'd been advisors? What would it say to the people involved in the process? And so we offered the person who objected the chance to not sign on to the guiding principles, but we wouldn't change the language. And that was the decision they made. They didn't sign on, but the language stayed the same. So I think that was another way in which we handled that, which was, we wrote it, it was able to be reviewed for a significant period of time, and ultimately it was an accurate reality that the old standards were not actively anti-racist, and they did contain racist statements, and they needed to be changed. To your point of the curriculum question, sort of how do we do this implementation? This is why it's so important to me that both our state board and our state superintendent's office has staff to support this, because DC is small enough that we are not going to get any textbook company to write us textbook level curricula for every grade. We're going to have to create the curricula that aligns with our standards. If we let every individual school district, DC, because of our charter LEAs has 72 now LEAs. Right, we have a lot of different school districts. If we leave the level of implementation up to that, we would get too much variation. So the state is actually going to write model curricula, including recommended texts and resources for schools and classrooms to be able to get. Now, schools will still have opportunity to go beyond that or to do something different, but that's an important part, I think, of the implementation, to make sure that teachers are not left to figure it out for themselves, but rather the state is providing that level of guidance and resource.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for the great questions.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all to our wonderful panel. Break up the discussion, but we are a little bit over time. So, which is, fine, we've got lots to say and lots to talk
Which is
about.
not fine.
No. So thanks again to our panel, our wonderful interpreter who is working hard over there. We have some snacks, so please stay, chat, mingle, ask more questions maybe that you didn't want to ask in the big group. And thanks for coming out. And thank you all so much for a great conversation.
Oh, we have some tokens of
Yes, you
appreciation.
do. Thank you. Please, get up, mingle, get something to eat. And we are all set.
Yeah, yeah.